The Vikings, often romanticized and misunderstood throughout history, were much more than the ruthless raiders that many people still imagine them to be. Originating from the Nordic countries of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the Vikings played a pivotal role in shaping the history of Europe and beyond, leaving a lasting legacy that continues to captivate our imagination. When we think of the Vikings, the first images that often come to mind are longships sailing through the mist, fierce warriors in horned helmets, and the vast, untamed landscapes of the north. However, the reality of their story is far more complex, and the Viking Age, which spanned from roughly the late 8th century to the early 11th century, was a period marked by exploration, trade, cultural exchange, and significant societal transformation. The Viking Age began with the infamous raid on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793, which shocked the Christian world. But the Vikings weren't merely raiders, they were seafarers, explorers, and settlers who sought new lands to trade, settle, and sometimes conquer. Their journeys took them far beyond the Scandinavian coasts, with Viking expeditions reaching as far west as North America, as far east as the Caspian Sea, and south to the Mediterranean. They established important trading routes, influencing the cultures and economies of the lands they encountered. The Vikings, as we know them, were also skilled craftsmen, farmers, and warriors, with an intricate social structure that was both advanced and adaptable to the harsh realities of their environment. Their society was founded on the values of strength, bravery, and honor, which were reflected in their mythology, legal systems, and daily lives. Norse gods, such as Odin, Thor, and Freya, played significant roles in the Viking worldview, shaping their behavior, beliefs, and customs. The Vikings viewed their lives as part of a larger cosmic struggle between order and chaos, with warriors aspiring to enter Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, upon their deaths. This belief system encouraged a fierce warrior culture, where personal valor was highly prized. At the same time, Viking society was not one-dimensional. Women had more freedom and influence in Viking culture than in many other contemporary societies, and the Vikings practiced a form of democracy through their assemblies, known as thanes. It's also important to note that the term Viking itself is somewhat misleading. In the Old Norse language, the word Viking referred to a specific type of expedition or raid rather than a specific ethnic group or nationality. Not all Norsemen were Vikings, just as not all modern-day Scandinavians are involved in exploration or conflict. The Viking Age is a period defined not by a single event or individual but by the collective activities of a people who were motivated by a complex mix of factors, including the search for resources, the desire for new land, and the inherent risk-taking spirit that defined their culture. In many ways, the history of the Vikings is the history of a people striving to carve out a place for themselves in a rapidly changing world. They were not just barbarians, they were visionaries who, through their travels, laid the groundwork for the globalized world we live in today. The Viking Age may have ended by the early 11th century, but the impact of the Vikings is still felt around the world, from the place names they left behind to the cultural traditions they passed on. The Vikings' story is far more nuanced than the simplistic image of bloodthirsty raiders. It's a tale of a people whose legacy continues to shape the world in unexpected ways. The origins of the Vikings are deeply rooted in the history and geography of Scandinavia. This region, made up of present-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, was shaped by harsh climates, rugged landscapes, and a challenging environment that fostered a culture of resilience and adaptability. The early Scandinavian societies were primarily agrarian, with small, self-sufficient farming communities that grew grains, raised livestock, and engaged in fishing. However, the Vikings did not emerge out of nowhere. They were part of a much older and rich cultural heritage. Long before they became known as seafarers and raiders, the Nordic people were already developing a distinctive culture that would eventually give rise to the Viking Age. The term Viking itself is somewhat misleading in this context. The word Viking comes from the Old Norse term Vikingur, which referred to someone who went on a Viking, essentially a sea raid or an expedition. It's important to note that not all Scandinavians were Vikings, and the Viking Age was a period marked by the activities of certain groups of people rather than a specific ethnic or national identity. The Viking Age began in the late 8th century and is traditionally dated from 793 AD, starting with the infamous raid on Lindisfarne, a small island off the coast of England. This event shocked the Christian world, marking the beginning of an era that would see waves of Viking raids and settlements across Europe. Scandinavia, during the early Viking Age, was a land of harsh winters and short growing seasons. The people who lived in this region had to be resilient and resourceful. They relied on a combination of farming, hunting, fishing, and trading to survive. The Vikings themselves were known for their exceptional seafaring skills. They were master shipbuilders, crafting longships that were lightweight, flexible, and fast, allowing them to travel vast distances. These ships, known for their speed and agility, were crucial to the Vikings' success as explorers, traders, and raiders. Their ships could navigate both shallow rivers and the open sea, making it possible for them to launch attacks on unsuspecting coastal towns or establish trade routes in far-flung parts of the world. The Vikings' expansion began as a response to a combination of social, economic, and environmental pressures. Scandinavian societies, which were small and often isolated, faced a growing population and limited resources. The search for new land, better farming opportunities, and trade routes was a natural consequence of this pressure. At the same time, Scandinavian society was built on a strong warrior ethos, where personal honor and strength in battle were highly valued. This culture of warrior pride, combined with the availability of powerful ships and the desire for wealth, led many young men to take to the seas in search of fortune and glory. By the time the Vikings began their raids, they were already skilled sailors, navigators, and traders. Their longships were not just vessels of war but also tools for exploration and trade. The Viking raids were initially focused on monasteries, churches, and undefended settlements, which were often rich in resources like gold, silver, and religious relics. These raids were brutal, but they were also a reflection of the Vikings' harsh worldview, shaped by their mythology and beliefs. Norse mythology, with its gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, provided a framework for understanding the world. For the Vikings, the act of raiding and fighting in battle was not just about material gain. It was also about proving one's worth and securing a place in the afterlife. The Viking worldview was deeply intertwined with their religious beliefs. They believed in a pantheon of gods and goddesses who ruled over different aspects of the world. Their beliefs were not based on dogma or scripture but on oral traditions and a deep connection to the natural world around them. Vikings worshipped their gods through rituals, sacrifices, and feasts, and they believed that warriors who died in battle would be rewarded with a place in Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where they would fight and feast until the end of the world. This belief in an afterlife where they could continue their warrior lifestyle was a driving force behind their raids and their exploration of new territories. In essence, the Vikings were a product of their environment. The harsh, unforgiving landscapes of Scandinavia created a people who were resourceful, tough, and unafraid to venture into the unknown. Their culture, built on a combination of seafaring prowess, warrior ethics, and a belief in the power of the gods, laid the foundation for the Viking Age and the incredible exploits that followed. Their expansion across Europe, and even as far as North America, was driven by a combination of necessity, opportunity, and a deeply ingrained sense of adventure. The Viking Age, though relatively short in historical terms, would leave an indelible mark on the world, shaping the course of history in ways that are still felt today. The Vikings are perhaps best known for their seafaring abilities, which were at the core of their way of life. The longship, a marvel of Viking engineering, was crucial to their success as both raiders and explorers. These ships were long, narrow, and designed for speed and agility, allowing them to navigate both the open sea and shallow rivers. The ships were constructed from a combination of oak and pine, with overlapping planks that made them incredibly flexible and durable. They were propelled by both oars and sails, and their shallow draft meant they could travel up rivers and attack inland settlements with surprising speed and stealth. This unique design enabled the Vikings to launch their raids on unsuspecting coastal towns and quickly escape before a counterattack could be organized. But the longship wasn't just a tool of destruction, it was also the vessel of choice for trade and exploration. The Vikings, always in search of new lands and opportunities, used their ships to establish extensive trade routes. They traveled to places as far as the Byzantine Empire, the Middle East, and even the distant shores of North America. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the Vikings established a trading network that spanned much of Europe, from the British Isles to the Mediterranean. The Vikings traded a wide variety of goods, from furs and timber to weapons, slaves, and even their own unique craftsmanship. In return, they brought back luxury items such as silver, spices, and silk, which had a significant impact on the economies of the regions they visited. In addition to their prowess as traders and raiders, the Vikings were also skilled settlers. As they ventured across the seas, they established new colonies and settlements in foreign lands. One of the most notable examples of Viking settlement was the founding of the Viking Kingdom of Dublin in Ireland. The Vikings first arrived in Ireland in the late 8th century, raiding monasteries and towns along the coast. However, they soon began to settle, and by the 9th century, Dublin had become a thriving Viking stronghold and a centre of trade in the Irish Sea. This settlement marked the beginning of a long-lasting Viking presence in Ireland, with Viking rulers holding power in Dublin for several centuries. The Vikings also settled in the British Isles, where their influence is still felt today. The Vikings began raiding England in the late 8th century, and by the 9th century, they had established the Danelaw, a Viking-controlled territory in the northeast of England. The Danelaw was a significant area where Norse laws, language, and customs were implemented, leaving a lasting impact on English society. In some parts of England, Viking settlers blended with the local population, and over time, the Vikings assimilated into Anglo-Saxon society. This fusion of cultures created a unique Anglo-Norse identity, which can still be seen in place names, language, and traditions in parts of England. Another significant Viking settlement was in Normandy, France. The Vikings, led by the legendary warrior Rollo, began raiding the northern coast of France in the 9th century. They eventually settled there, and in 911, Rollo was granted land by the French king Charles the Simple in exchange for his loyalty. This land became known as Normandy, and the Norsemen who settled there became known as the Normans. Over time, the Normans would become a powerful force in European history, with one of their own, William the Conqueror, famously invading England in 1066. The Norman conquest of England marked the end of the Viking Age and the beginning of a new era in English history. While the Vikings are often remembered for their raids and conquests, their role as traders and settlers was equally important. They didn't just come to plunder, they came to build, trade, and create new societies. Their voyages and expeditions helped to shape the medieval world, connecting distant regions and fostering cultural exchange. The Vikings' ability to navigate vast distances, adapt to new environments, and establish thriving communities made them one of the most influential peoples of the early Middle Ages. The Viking Age eventually came to an end, but the legacy of the Vikings lives on. Their ships, their settlements, and their influence on the cultures they encountered left an indelible mark on the world. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were pioneers, explorers, and builders, whose exploits helped shape the course of history. Their voyages and the networks they established laid the foundation for the globalized world that we live in today, and their story continues to fascinate and inspire us. The Vikings were not just raiders and traders, they were also fierce warriors, and their society was deeply shaped by the values of combat, honor, and the warrior ethos. This warrior culture is perhaps one of the most enduring aspects of the Viking legacy. The Vikings placed great importance on bravery, personal strength, and valor in battle, with their society built around the idea that a man's worth was measured by his actions in combat. This idea was reinforced by Norse mythology, which was rich with tales of gods and heroes who fought epic battles in an eternal struggle between order and chaos. The gods themselves, such as Odin, the god of war, and Thor, the god of thunder, were seen as paragons of strength and courage. For the Vikings, to fight valiantly in battle was to follow the example set by the gods themselves. The Vikings' belief in the importance of combat and warrior values was not just a cultural aspect but also a practical one. A large portion of Viking society was made up of warriors who trained from a young age to fight with weapons like swords, axes, and spears. These warriors were organized into bands known as hird, and they often served as elite soldiers for chieftains or kings. They also formed the backbone of Viking raids, where their fighting skills were put to the test. The Vikings were known for their fearsome and brutal tactics in battle, often using psychological warfare to intimidate their enemies. Their longships allowed them to strike quickly and unexpectedly, launching surprise attacks on coastal settlements before the defenders could mount a defense. The Viking warrior was not just a soldier, he was a man of honor. Viking society placed great emphasis on personal honor, and warriors were expected to uphold a code of conduct that emphasized loyalty, bravery, and fairness. A Viking warrior who fought valiantly in battle and achieved great deeds could earn the respect of his peers and gain wealth and prestige. Conversely, a warrior who fled from battle or acted cowardly would be shunned by society and lose his honor. This emphasis on honor extended beyond the battlefield and into all aspects of Viking life, including their legal system and social structure. One of the most iconic aspects of Viking warrior culture was their concept of the afterlife. The Vikings believed that those who died in battle would be rewarded by the gods with a place in Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. Valhalla was a glorious afterlife where warriors would feast and fight until the end of the world. This belief in an eternal afterlife in the company of the gods was a powerful motivator for the Vikings. For many, it was a driving force behind their desire to raid and fight, as it was seen as a way to secure a place in Valhalla. The idea of earning a spot in this glorious afterlife helped to shape the Vikings' approach to combat, making them fearless in the face of death. But the Vikings were not only fearsome in battle. They were also adept at using their strength and combat skills for political purposes. Viking chieftains and kings often relied on their warriors to maintain control over their territories and to expand their power. Raids and conquests were a way to increase wealth and influence, and the Vikings were not afraid to use force to achieve their goals. The Vikings were known for their complex system of alliances and rivalries, which were often shaped by the warrior class. These relationships were reinforced by acts of loyalty and betrayal, with warriors frequently switching allegiances depending on which side offered the most opportunity or reward. The warrior ethos of the Vikings also extended to their legal system. The Vikings practiced a form of democracy through assemblies known as thanes. These were gatherings where free men would come together to discuss important matters, make decisions, and resolve disputes. The thanes were not just political gatherings, they were also a place where a warrior's honor could be challenged or defended. If a man was accused of a crime or dishonorable behavior, he could challenge the accuser to a duel or trial by combat. This practice was rooted in the Viking belief that personal honor was paramount and that justice should be determined through combat or negotiation rather than by law courts. Viking warriors were also known for their distinctive appearance. They often wore fur and leather, with chainmail and helmets to protect themselves in battle. The most famous Viking helmet, often depicted with horns, is actually a misrepresentation. There is no historical evidence to suggest that Vikings wore horned helmets. Nevertheless, the image of the horned helmet has become deeply ingrained in popular culture. Vikings also decorated their weapons and armor with intricate designs, often featuring symbols of their gods and their heritage. Their swords, in particular, were highly prized and often passed down through generations as family heirlooms. These weapons were not just tools of war, they were symbols of status and power. In many ways, the Vikings' warrior culture was both a source of their strength and a reflection of the society they built. Their beliefs in honor, bravery, and strength in battle shaped not only their approach to combat but also their interactions with the world. It was through their warriors that the Vikings were able to expand their influence across Europe, establish powerful kingdoms, and leave a lasting legacy that continues to shape the modern world's understanding of the Viking Age. The Viking presence in the British Isles is one of the most well-known chapters of their history, and it had a profound impact on the culture, politics, and society of England, Ireland, and Scotland. The Viking raids began in the late 8th century, with the infamous attack on Lindisfarne in 793 marking the beginning of a series of devastating raids along the coastlines of the British Isles. Lindisfarne, an island off the coast of Northumbria, was home to a rich Christian monastery, making it a prime target for the Viking warriors. The raid on Lindisfarne sent shockwaves through Europe, signaling the arrival of a new, terrifying force in the form of the Vikings. However, while these early Viking raids were violent and brutal, they also marked the beginning of a long and complex relationship between the Vikings and the peoples of the British Isles. At first, the Vikings primarily conducted raids for plunder. Their longships allowed them to travel swiftly along the coasts, attacking monasteries, towns, and villages that were often poorly defended. The monasteries, rich in gold and precious artifacts, were particularly tempting targets. The Vikings would plunder these places, taking everything of value, and then retreat back to their ships, often disappearing as quickly as they had come. These raids continued for several decades, with the Vikings striking throughout the British Isles, from England to Ireland to Scotland. But as time went on, the nature of Viking activity began to change. Rather than just raiding and plundering, the Vikings began to settle in the lands they had once attacked. One of the most significant Viking settlements was in the Danelaw, a territory in England that was controlled by the Vikings. In the early 9th century, Viking forces began to conquer large parts of northern and eastern England, establishing their own kingdom in the region. This kingdom, known as the Danelaw, was a Viking-controlled area where Norse laws, customs, and language were dominant. Over time, the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons began to mix, with Viking settlers intermarrying with the local population. This blending of cultures created a unique Anglo-Norse identity that influenced the language, place names, and legal systems of the region. In addition to their settlements in England, the Vikings also established a strong presence in Ireland. The Vikings first raided Ireland in the late 8th century, targeting monasteries along the coast. But by the early 9th century, they began to establish permanent settlements. One of the most important Viking cities in Ireland was Dublin, which the Vikings founded in 841. Dublin became a major centre of trade and commerce, connecting Ireland with the wider Viking world. The Vikings ruled Dublin for several centuries, and the city remained an important Viking stronghold until the 12th century. Throughout Ireland, Viking influence can still be seen today in the many place names and archaeological sites that bear witness to their presence. The Vikings also played a significant role in the politics of the British Isles. In England, Viking kings and chieftains such as Ivar the Boneless and Guthrum engaged in battles with the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. One of the most famous Viking leaders, Ragnar Lodbrok, is believed to have raided the kingdom of Northumbria and led attacks against the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia. However, it wasn't just the Viking warriors who influenced the course of British history. The Vikings also brought with them new forms of governance and legal systems. The Viking Thing, a form of assembly or council, played a significant role in the political organization of the Viking settlements. These assemblies were a place where free men could come together to discuss matters of law, resolve disputes, and make decisions for the community. While the Vikings were often seen as ruthless invaders, their legacy in the British Isles is far more complex. Their raids and settlements led to the creation of a new Anglo-Norse culture, with a rich blend of Viking and Anglo-Saxon traditions. The Vikings introduced new farming techniques, architectural styles, and even new words to the English language. Many of the place names in England, especially in the north and east, are derived from Old Norse, reflecting the lasting impact of the Vikings on the landscape. In fact, nearly a quarter of English place names come from the Vikings, such as the suffix "by", meaning town or village, which is common in place names like Derby, Kirby, and Rugby. In addition to their cultural impact, the Vikings also had a lasting effect on the political landscape of the British Isles. The Danelaw created a division between the Viking-controlled areas and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and it wasn't until the 10th century that the Anglo-Saxons, under kings like Alfred the Great and Aethelstan, managed to regain control of the Danelaw. Despite this, the Vikings continued to influence the development of England's legal and political systems. In fact, many historians believe that the Viking legal system, based on the concept of the thing, had a lasting impact on the development of common law in England. The Viking presence in Ireland and Scotland was also significant. In Ireland, Viking rule in Dublin lasted until the 12th century, and in Scotland, the Vikings established the Kingdom of the Isles, which controlled large parts of the western coast and the Hebrides. The Viking influence in Scotland and Ireland can still be seen today in the culture, language, and place names of these regions. Overall, the Vikings' impact on the British Isles was far-reaching and profound. From their initial raids to their eventual settlement and integration into the societies they encountered, the Vikings left a lasting legacy in the language, culture, and political systems of the British Isles. Their story is one of both destruction and creation, as they reshaped the landscape of medieval Europe and left their mark on history. The Vikings' expansion also reached beyond the British Isles, profoundly influencing regions across Europe and even venturing to North America. One of the most significant chapters in their history was their involvement in France, particularly their role in the establishment of the Duchy of Normandy. The Vikings, who had begun raiding the northern coasts of France in the 9th century, soon saw the opportunity to settle and create a power base in the region. These Viking invaders, led by the legendary warrior Rollo, initially came as raiders, attacking the wealthier coastal regions of Francia. However, by the early 10th century, their relationship with the French King Charles the Simple took a pivotal turn. In 911, Charles granted Rollo and his followers land in exchange for their loyalty and protection of the region from other Viking raiders. This land, which would come to be known as Normandy, became the heart of Viking settlement in France. The Normans, as they were called, adopted the local language and customs, eventually becoming an integral part of the medieval European world. Over time, the Norsemen of Normandy intermarried with the local population, and their descendants would go on to play a crucial role in European history. One of the most famous of these descendants was William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who successfully invaded England in 1066, leading to the Norman conquest. This conquest not only brought Normandy into closer contact with England but also forever altered the course of English history. The Normans introduced new systems of governance, feudal structures, and cultural influences that would shape the development of England for centuries. The establishment of Normandy also had lasting effects on the broader European political landscape. As the Vikings settled in the region, they helped transform it from a relatively isolated and lawless land into a powerful duchy with strong military and political influence. The Vikings' prowess as warriors and leaders enabled them to rise rapidly within the feudal structure of medieval Europe. They brought with them their military experience and organization, which would later be critical in the expansion of the Norman Empire under William. Normandy's Viking heritage was so deeply ingrained that the Normans continued to maintain strong ties to Scandinavia, even as they assimilated into French culture. This connection would influence European politics and warfare for generations, as the Normans spread their influence across Europe. Beyond France, the Vikings also left their mark on the Mediterranean. While their raids on the Mediterranean were not as extensive as their attacks on northern Europe, the Vikings did venture into southern Europe, reaching as far as Sicily and even engaging with the Byzantine Empire. In the 10th century, Viking mercenaries, known as the Varangians, served in the Byzantine Empire, becoming an elite guard known as the Varangian Guard. These Norsemen, who had initially come to the Byzantine Empire as traders and raiders, eventually earned a reputation for their fierce loyalty and combat prowess, making them one of the most feared military units in the empire. The presence of the Varangian Guard in Constantinople is a testament to the Vikings' influence in the Mediterranean world and their ability to adapt to new environments. However, the most famous of the Vikings' exploratory achievements was their brief but significant presence in North America. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, led an expedition across the Atlantic to what is now known as Newfoundland, Canada. The site of their settlement, known as Vinland, was discovered in the early 20th century and has since been the subject of much archaeological study. The Vikings in North America are thought to have established a small settlement in this area, although it was short-lived. The harsh conditions and conflict with indigenous peoples likely led to the abandonment of the settlement. Nevertheless, the fact that the Vikings were the first known Europeans to set foot in North America, nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus, is a remarkable achievement. The Vikings' exploration of North America was part of their larger pattern of expansion, which was driven by both necessity and opportunity. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were explorers, seeking out new lands to settle, trade with, and sometimes conquer. Their ships, which were capable of navigating both the open seas and shallow rivers, enabled them to venture into territories that other Europeans had not yet discovered. The Vikings' ability to establish settlements and trade routes across such vast distances is a testament to their remarkable skills as seafarers and explorers. In addition to their seafaring ventures, the Vikings were also skilled traders. They established a vast network of trade routes that spanned much of Europe, Asia, and even parts of the Middle East. From their base in Scandinavia, the Vikings traded goods such as furs, amber, and iron, and in return, they brought back luxury items like silk, silver, and spices. The Vikings' extensive trade routes connected distant regions and helped to facilitate cultural exchange. This network also played a significant role in the Viking economy, enabling them to acquire wealth and resources that would sustain their raids and settlements. The Vikings' travels and conquests were not without their challenges. They faced resistance from the peoples they encountered, particularly from the kingdoms of Western Europe, which eventually led to the decline of the Viking Age. By the end of the 11th century, the Vikings had largely settled into the societies they had once raided. The Christianization of Scandinavia, the decline of Viking raids, and the gradual assimilation of Viking settlers into local cultures marked the end of the Viking Age. However, the Vikings' influence on the world did not disappear. Their legacy can still be seen in the place names, legal systems, and cultural traditions of the regions they once occupied. The Vikings were not just raiders and warriors, they were explorers, traders, and settlers whose impact on history continues to resonate today. The Viking society was not just defined by warfare and exploration. It was also a culture with complex social structures, legal systems, and a rich mythology that influenced every aspect of daily life. The social hierarchy of the Vikings was based on a system of class divisions that played a major role in how Viking society functioned. At the top of this hierarchy were the kings and chieftains, who ruled over the Viking clans and territories. These leaders were often seen as semi-divine figures, possessing both political and religious authority. Below them were the warriors, who formed the backbone of Viking society. These men, known as herd, were the elite fighters who followed their leaders into battle, gained fame through their exploits, and were rewarded with land and treasure. The warriors also had considerable influence in Viking communities, often serving as protectors, enforcers of laws, and symbols of honor. In the middle of the social structure were the carls, the freemen or commoners. The carls were farmers, craftsmen, traders, and merchants who made up the majority of Viking society. These men and women were free to own land, work their trades, and participate in the local assemblies, known as things, which were gatherings where decisions were made and legal disputes were settled. The carls were the foundation of Viking society, contributing to the economy and cultural life through their labor and skills. While they were not as wealthy or influential as the chieftains or warriors, the carls held an important place in the Viking world, and their actions and decisions helped shape the society around them. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the thralls or slaves. The thralls were often captured during raids or taken from conquered lands, and they had no rights or freedoms. They were forced to work on farms, in workshops, or as household servants. Despite their low status, thralls could sometimes buy their freedom or earn it through good service. However, life as a thrall was harsh and brutal, and most thralls lived in a state of subjugation. It is worth noting that while the thralls were at the bottom of the social ladder, they played an important role in maintaining the Viking economy. Without their labor, the more privileged classes would not have been able to maintain their wealth and power. The legal system in Viking society was highly developed and focused on a concept of justice that was grounded in personal honor. One of the key features of Viking law was the thing, a local assembly or gathering where free men came together to make decisions, settle disputes, and pass judgments. The thing was a form of direct democracy, where participants could present their cases, argue for justice, and come to a decision by consensus. The things were not only used for legal matters, they were also a space for political discussion, socializing, and networking. In some regions, the thing was a critical part of the Viking system of governance, allowing free men to play an active role in shaping the direction of their communities. The Viking legal system also included the concept of wergild, or the payment of compensation for injuries or deaths. If someone was killed, the family of the victim could demand a payment from the perpetrator or his family as restitution. This was seen as a way to maintain balance and prevent cycles of vengeance from escalating into further violence. Wergild was an important part of Viking justice, and the amount of compensation varied depending on the status of the victim. The more powerful or influential the person, the higher the compensation. Beyond the legal system, Viking society was deeply influenced by its rich mythology and religious beliefs. Norse mythology was filled with gods, goddesses, and legendary figures who represented various aspects of life, death, and the natural world. The most powerful and revered god in Viking culture was Odin, the Allfather, who was associated with war, wisdom, and death. Odin was often depicted as a wise and mysterious figure who wandered the world in search of knowledge. His followers believed that those who died bravely in battle would be rewarded by Odin, receiving a place in Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain. In Valhalla, the bravest warriors would live in eternal glory, feasting and fighting until the end of the world. Thor, the god of thunder, was another important figure in Viking mythology. Thor was seen as a protector of the people, guarding them against the forces of chaos and destruction. He wielded the mighty hammer Mjolnir, which was said to have the power to strike down giants and protect the gods and humans alike. Thor's image as a strong and protective figure resonated with the Vikings, who admired physical strength and bravery in battle. The goddesses, too, played a significant role in Viking religion. Freya, the goddess of love, fertility, and war, was a central figure in Norse mythology. She was believed to have the power to influence the fate of warriors and was often invoked by Viking women who sought protection or guidance. The Valkyries, female warriors who served Odin, were also an important part of Viking belief. These powerful women would choose which warriors were worthy of entering Valhalla, ensuring that only the bravest would join the gods in the afterlife. Viking religious practices were centered around rituals and sacrifices, which were believed to appease the gods and secure their favor. The Vikings held feasts, ceremonies, and sacrifices to honor their gods and seek their blessings for success in battle, good harvests, and protection from harm. These rituals were often conducted at sacred sites, such as groves or temples, and were an essential part of Viking life. The Vikings' belief in the gods and their connection to the supernatural was not just a form of religious practice. It was deeply integrated into every aspect of their lives. Whether in battle, governance, or everyday activities, the influence of their gods and their mythology was felt at all levels of society. This connection to the divine helped to shape Viking identity, providing a framework for understanding the world and a sense of purpose in their actions. As the Viking Age progressed, one of the most significant transformations in Viking society was the gradual Christianization of Scandinavia. The introduction of Christianity to the Vikings brought profound changes to their religious practices, social structure, and worldview. For centuries, the Vikings had followed their traditional Norse religion, with its pantheon of gods and elaborate rituals. However, by the 10th and 11th centuries, Christian missionaries began to make inroads into the Viking territories, bringing with them a new faith that would ultimately replace the Old Norse beliefs. The first significant steps toward Christianization came in the Viking Kingdom of Norway. In the late 10th century, King Olaf Tryggvason, who had converted to Christianity while living in England, returned to Norway with the intention of spreading the Christian faith among his people. Olaf was a strong and forceful leader, and he believed that Christianity was essential for the future of Norway. He used a combination of persuasion and force to convert his subjects, often using threats and even violence to encourage conversion. Olaf's efforts were not always successful, and many Vikings resisted the new religion, holding on to their old gods and traditions. However, by the early 11th century, Christianity had become firmly established in Norway, with the construction of churches and the establishment of Christian institutions. In Denmark, the process of Christianization was somewhat less violent. King Harald Bluetooth, who ruled Denmark from the mid-10th century, is credited with officially adopting Christianity as the state religion. Harald's conversion to Christianity was likely motivated by both political and religious factors. By converting to Christianity, Harald was able to strengthen his ties with the Christian kingdoms of Europe, particularly the Holy Roman Empire, and gain the support of Christian missionaries. Harald's conversion also marked the beginning of a gradual shift toward Christianity in Denmark, and by the end of the 10th century, Christianity was well established in the kingdom. Sweden, however, was slower to adopt Christianity. While there were Christian influences in the region from the 9th century, it wasn't until the early 11th century that Sweden formally converted to Christianity. The process was driven by a combination of missionary efforts, royal influence, and the changing political landscape in Europe. The conversion of Sweden was also facilitated by the growing power of the Christian Church, which played an increasingly important role in the governance of medieval Europe. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, the Vikings gradually abandoned their old religious practices. Pagan rituals, such as human sacrifices and temple worship, were replaced by Christian rites, and the old gods were supplanted by the Christian God. The Christianization of the Vikings had profound effects on Viking society. The Vikings, who had once been known for their warrior ethos and pagan beliefs, began to adopt Christian values and practices. Christian teachings about peace, forgiveness, and the afterlife began to influence Viking attitudes, particularly in relation to war and violence. The Vikings, who had once believed that dying in battle was the ultimate honor, now began to focus more on salvation and the prospect of eternal life in heaven. The emphasis on violence and personal glory that had been central to Viking culture slowly began to diminish, replaced by a more peaceful, religious worldview. Another significant impact of Christianization was the transformation of Viking law and governance. Before the arrival of Christianity, Viking laws were based on a system of honor and personal retribution, with disputes often settled through combat or compensation. However, with the spread of Christianity, the Vikings began to adopt more formalized legal systems, influenced by Christian teachings on justice, mercy, and forgiveness. The Christian Church also began to play a larger role in the legal system, with clergy acting as judges and mediators in disputes. Despite these changes, however, many aspects of Viking culture persisted even after the adoption of Christianity. For example, the Vikings' love of storytelling and mythology remained strong, and many Viking sagas continued to be told and written down long after the old gods had been abandoned. The Vikings also maintained their strong warrior traditions, with warriors still seen as heroes in Viking society, albeit within the context of Christian morality. In fact, some Viking sagas even merged elements of Christian and pagan beliefs, creating a unique blend of the two traditions. In addition to religious transformation, the Christianization of the Vikings also had a significant impact on their relationships with other European cultures. As the Vikings embraced Christianity, they became more integrated into the broader Christian world, particularly in the context of trade, diplomacy, and warfare. The conversion of the Vikings helped to pave the way for increased interaction with other European kingdoms, which had significant consequences for the political landscape of medieval Europe. The Vikings, once seen as ruthless raiders, now became part of the broader European community, and their relationship with other Christian kingdoms was gradually transformed. The spread of Christianity also led to the decline of the Viking raids. As the Vikings converted to Christianity, the religious and cultural motivations that had once driven their raids became less important. The raids themselves became less frequent, and by the end of the 11th century, the Viking Age came to an end. The Christianization of Scandinavia marked the close of an era, but it also laid the foundation for the development of medieval European society, as the Vikings transitioned from a warrior culture to a more settled, Christianized way of life. Despite the end of the Viking Age, the legacy of the Vikings continues to influence modern culture. Their exploration, settlement, and trade laid the groundwork for the development of Europe, and their impact on language, culture, and governance can still be seen today. While the Vikings' transition to Christianity marked the end of one chapter in their history, it also symbolized the beginning of a new era for Scandinavia and for the world. The decline of the Viking Age came about for a variety of reasons, most notably the consolidation of power within the kingdoms of Scandinavia and the broader political and social shifts in Europe. The Viking Age, which lasted roughly from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, was a period of constant expansion and exploration for the Vikings. However, by the 11th century, a number of factors contributed to the fading of their influence and the eventual end of their raids and conquests. One of the key reasons for the decline of the Viking Age was the increasing unification of the Scandinavian kingdoms. By the beginning of the 11th century, the once fractured and divided territories of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden began to consolidate under strong and centralized monarchies. The kings of these nations, such as King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark and King Olaf Haraldsson of Norway, began to assert more control over their realms, which in turn reduced the ability of individual Viking chieftains and warlords to lead independent raids. This centralization of power meant that the Vikings had less autonomy and fewer opportunities to launch raids on other countries, especially as the monarchs began to strengthen their defenses and form alliances with other European powers. In addition to the political consolidation within Scandinavia, the Christianization of the Vikings also played a significant role in the decline of the Viking Age. As the Vikings converted to Christianity, their religious beliefs and values began to change. The Vikings, who had once seen raiding and conquest as essential parts of their identity and belief system, began to adopt Christian values that emphasized peace, forgiveness, and salvation. The once prominent warrior culture that had fueled Viking expansion began to diminish, as the new Christian norms began to shape their behavior and priorities. The warrior ethos that had driven the Vikings to raid and conquer gave way to a more settled lifestyle focused on farming, trade, and local governance. Another factor contributing to the decline of the Viking Age was the growing resistance from the peoples they had once raided. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the kingdoms of England, France, and Ireland had strengthened their military forces, making it increasingly difficult for the Vikings to conduct successful raids. The Vikings, who had once been feared for their speed and surprise attacks, now faced more organized and well-equipped armies. The Anglo-Saxons, in particular, had learned to defend themselves against Viking raids, and the defeat of Viking forces at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, where King Harold Godwinson of England defeated the Norwegian Viking king Harald Hardrada, marked the symbolic end of Viking invasions of England. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, which took place just weeks before the Norman conquest of England, was a decisive moment in the Viking Age. Harald Hardrada, one of the last great Viking kings, was killed in battle, and with his death came the collapse of Viking power in England. The battle also marked the end of the era of large-scale Viking invasions. The Anglo-Saxons, now more unified and militarily capable, were able to repel any further attempts at Viking conquest. The rise of feudalism in Europe, along with the strengthening of centralized monarchies, made it more difficult for the Vikings to continue their raids. In addition to military defeat, the Vikings also faced changing economic conditions that contributed to the decline of their raids. During the early Viking Age, there was a strong demand for the goods that the Vikings plundered, especially silver, gold, and other precious commodities. However, as trade routes expanded and the European economy began to shift, the incentive for raiding diminished. The Vikings had begun to establish trade routes to acquire wealth through peaceful means, and they found that the spoils of trade could be just as profitable, if not more so, than the loot from raiding. The development of markets and cities, especially in the Viking-controlled territories of England, Ireland, and France, allowed the Vikings to integrate more fully into the European economy, further reducing their reliance on raids. The final blow to the Viking Age came with the Norman conquest of England in 1066. The Normans, descendants of Viking settlers in Normandy, had assimilated into the broader European feudal system, and they brought with them the military tactics, governance structures, and legal systems that the Vikings had once used in their own raids. Led by William the Conqueror, the Normans invaded England and defeated the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. The success of the Normans effectively ended the Viking Age, as the Viking influence in England was subsumed by the new Norman rulers. The Normans established a feudal kingdom that integrated Viking traditions with French and Anglo-Saxon customs, ushering in a new era in English history. Although the Viking Age came to an end in the 11th century, the legacy of the Vikings lived on in the lands they had once raided and settled. The Vikings had established lasting settlements in England, Ireland, France, and even North America, and their influence continued to shape the cultural and political landscape of Europe. The Vikings' impact on language, place names, and legal systems can still be seen in many parts of modern Europe. The legacy of Viking explorers and traders also lived on, as the Vikings' extensive trade networks and cultural exchanges helped lay the foundation for the later development of European societies. While the Viking Age may have ended with the rise of powerful monarchies and the decline of Viking raids, the story of the Vikings is far from over. Today, the Vikings remain a fascinating subject of study, with their history continuing to captivate the imagination of people around the world. Whether through literature, television, or archaeology, the Vikings continue to leave their mark on modern culture, and their legacy remains an integral part of European and world history. The legacy of the Vikings, though the Viking Age itself came to an end by the mid-11th century, continues to resonate through history and popular culture in powerful ways. The impact of the Vikings is not confined solely to their era of raiding and conquering but extends into many aspects of modern society, including language, culture, governance, and even mythology. The Vikings, often remembered as fierce warriors and seafarers, also left behind a rich cultural and historical footprint that has influenced and shaped the world long after their raids ceased. One of the most enduring elements of Viking legacy is the influence they had on the languages and place names of the regions they settled. Viking settlements in areas such as England, Ireland, Scotland, and Normandy have left behind a wealth of place names derived from Old Norse, the language spoken by the Vikings. In England, for example, Place names such as York, Derby, and Grimsby are all derived from Old Norse, reflecting the Viking presence in the region. This linguistic influence can also be seen in modern English vocabulary, with many words having roots in Old Norse. Terms like sky, husband, and berserk all have Viking origins, and the language itself has evolved with numerous elements from Viking culture embedded within it. In addition to language, the Vikings also had a lasting impact on European legal systems. Viking legal practices, particularly their system of assemblies known as things, influenced the development of democracy in Europe. These assemblies, where free men gathered to discuss and resolve legal matters, served as the foundation for later parliamentary systems in Scandinavian countries. The Vikings' concept of justice and personal honor, coupled with their emphasis on community decision-making, played a role in the development of more structured legal systems throughout Europe. In fact, the Viking influence can be seen in the English common law system, particularly in the incorporation of jury trials and the legal rights of individuals. The Vikings also made significant contributions to the fields of exploration and trade. Their advanced shipbuilding techniques allowed them to navigate vast distances, from the frozen waters of the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean and even North America. The Viking longship was an engineering marvel of its time, enabling the Vikings to establish extensive trade networks that connected distant parts of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. These trade routes allowed the Vikings to bring back goods such as silk, spices, and silver, which had a profound impact on the European economy. The Vikings' expansion into North America, although short-lived, is particularly significant as they were the first known Europeans to set foot on the continent, long before Columbus. Their brief settlement in Newfoundland, Canada, known as Vinland, is a testament to their seafaring prowess and adventurous spirit. The Viking legacy is also strongly felt in modern pop culture. In recent years, the portrayal of the Vikings has become an enduring element of media, literature, and entertainment. Shows like Vikings and The Last Kingdom, as well as films and novels, have revived the public fascination with Viking history and culture. These depictions, though often dramatized, have contributed to a resurgence of interest in Viking history, bringing their stories to new generations. This renewed interest has also led to a boom in archaeological discoveries, as more and more Viking burial sites, settlements, and artifacts are uncovered, offering new insights into their daily lives, trade practices, and social structures. While the Vikings have become symbols of barbarism and savagery in many respects, especially in their early raids, modern scholarship has increasingly sought to highlight the complexity of their society. The Vikings were not just brutal raiders, they were skilled farmers, craftsmen, traders, and explorers, and they built societies that thrived for centuries. They established vibrant communities in the lands they settled, with their own systems of governance, laws, and cultural traditions. The Viking sagas, which chronicle their epic journeys and heroic deeds, continue to be an essential part of their cultural heritage, offering a window into the past and a glimpse into the lives of these legendary figures. Furthermore, Viking mythology, with its gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, continues to capture the imagination of people around the world. Norse mythology has had a significant influence on modern fantasy literature, films, and television shows. The stories of the Vikings' gods, with their epic battles, dramatic tales of love and betrayal, and their connections to the natural world, have inspired generations of writers, artists, and filmmakers. From J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth to Marvel's portrayal of Thor, Viking mythology continues to play a prominent role in shaping modern stories and characters. Perhaps one of the most powerful aspects of Viking legacy is the continued reverence for their warrior ethos and their emphasis on honor, courage, and adventure. The image of the Viking as a fearless warrior who traveled across the seas in search of glory and riches has become a symbol of boldness and daring in modern culture. This ethos, combined with their remarkable achievements in shipbuilding, exploration, and trade, makes the Vikings one of history's most fascinating and enduring cultures. The Vikings were a people whose influence far surpassed their small geographical origins. Their explorations, settlements, and cultural contributions continued to shape the world, and their legacy is celebrated in numerous ways today. The Viking Age may have ended centuries ago, but the impact of the Vikings on language, culture, law, and exploration remains significant, making their story one that will continue to captivate generations to come. The Vikings' legacy, although intertwined with their violent and often destructive raids, also lives on in the societies they helped shape and the lasting impact they had on the world's development. Even after their raids and settlements slowed and the Viking Age eventually ended, the cultural, political, and historical influences of the Vikings continued to resonate throughout Europe and beyond. Their remarkable achievements as sailors, warriors, settlers, and traders laid the groundwork for the medieval world and set the stage for many of the transformations that would come in the centuries following their decline. In Scandinavia, the Vikings' transformation into more Christianized and centralized societies marked the end of their era as independent raiders and conquerors, but the memory of their daring exploits continued to shape the identity of the Nordic peoples. By the end of the Viking Age, Scandinavian monarchies had consolidated power, and the Viking warrior ethos evolved into a more structured, feudal system. Despite the consolidation of power, many Viking traditions endured, including their commitment to exploration, trade, and an enduring sense of national pride in their ancient history. The lasting imprint of Viking influence can be seen in the political structures that followed. The Viking Kingdom of Normandy, founded by Rollo and his descendants, proved to be one of the most important examples of Viking settlers who adapted to and influenced the European feudal system. The Normans, particularly under William the Conqueror, would play a critical role in shaping the development of England, merging Viking and Anglo-Saxon cultures to create a new, hybrid society. This fusion helped propel the formation of a more unified English kingdom that laid the groundwork for the English monarchy and legal system. Beyond the shores of Europe, the Vikings' exploratory spirit had a lasting effect. Their sea voyages led to settlements in Greenland, Iceland, and Newfoundland, providing some of the earliest recorded contact between Europe and the Americas. Though these settlements were short-lived, the Vikings' ability to travel vast distances, navigate the treacherous North Atlantic, and establish a foothold in far-flung lands showcased their exceptional maritime skills and laid the groundwork for future exploration and colonial ventures by later European powers. The Vikings' contributions to trade and commerce were another lasting part of their legacy. The extensive trade routes they established throughout Europe, Asia, and the Middle East helped shape the economic landscape of the medieval world. Viking trading hubs like York, Dublin, and Novgorod became important centers of commerce, linking different cultures and economies. Through their vast networks, the Vikings facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between East and West. Items like spices, silk, and precious metals were traded, and the Vikings were responsible for transporting goods across long distances, often through unfamiliar and hostile territories. These networks not only strengthened their economies but also helped to connect the distant corners of Europe, fostering a spirit of cross-cultural exchange that would be a hallmark of the later Middle Ages. In addition to the political and economic legacies they left behind, the Vikings also left their mark in the arts, literature, and mythology. The sagas and poems written by Viking skalds, the poets who chronicled the deeds of Viking heroes, continue to be among the most important literary works in Scandinavian culture. These epic tales, often focused on heroism, loyalty, and the conflicts between gods and men, help preserve the values and traditions of the Viking people. The sagas also provide a glimpse into the lives and beliefs of the Vikings, painting a vivid picture of a world filled with danger, adventure, and the constant pursuit of honor. These stories continue to captivate readers and have inspired generations of authors, poets, and filmmakers, keeping the Viking spirit alive in modern popular culture. Moreover, Viking mythology has had a significant influence on contemporary fantasy literature and pop culture. The gods and goddesses of Norse mythology, such as Odin, Thor, and Loki, have become iconic figures in modern storytelling, appearing in everything from Marvel comics and films to fantasy novels like J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. The image of Thor, with his mighty hammer Mjolnir, and Odin, the all-seeing father of the gods, has been reimagined and adapted countless times, making Viking mythology one of the most enduring sources of inspiration in the fantasy genre. The Viking influence also extends to modern-day Scandinavia, where the idea of Viking heritage is a source of pride and cultural identity. National museums, historical sites, and festivals celebrate the Viking past, drawing both locals and tourists who are fascinated by the stories and artifacts of this ancient civilization. Viking reenactments and cultural festivals are held regularly, allowing people to experience what life may have been like in the Viking Age, and scholars continue to explore and reinterpret Viking history and its significance. Even in the English-speaking world, the Vikings remain a central part of national identity and popular culture, particularly in regions once affected by their raids and settlements. The Viking legacy is deeply ingrained in the history of countries like England, Ireland, and Scotland, where traces of Viking culture can still be found in place names, language, and local traditions. For instance, in areas such as Yorkshire and the northeast of England, many surnames and place names are derived from Old Norse, reflecting the lasting imprint of the Vikings on the landscape. The Vikings' contributions to language, governance, and society continue to be recognized and celebrated in modern times. In conclusion, the Viking Age may have ended over 1,000 years ago, but the legacy of the Vikings lives on in ways that continue to shape the modern world. From their influence on language and legal systems to their contributions to trade, exploration, and mythology, the Vikings left an indelible mark on history. Today, their legacy is not just a reminder of a brutal, warlike past but a testament to a complex and enduring civilization that shaped the course of history and continues to inspire wonder and fascination in the present day. The Vikings were not only the fearsome warriors and raiders that many imagined but also explorers, traders, settlers, and innovators whose contributions to the world are still felt today. The Vikings, often mythologized as brutal raiders and warriors, were in reality a complex and multifaceted society whose influence has persisted across centuries. The end of the Viking Age marked a transition from raiding and expansion to settlement, governance, and integration into larger European power structures. By the early 11th century, the Viking world was undergoing a profound transformation, with the establishment of more centralized kingdoms, the spread of Christianity, and the assimilation of Viking settlers into local cultures. However, the legacy of the Vikings extended far beyond their raids, reaching into the social, political, and cultural fabric of medieval Europe. One of the most lasting legacies of the Vikings was their impact on European political structures, particularly in Scandinavia and the British Isles. The Vikings' ability to forge new kingdoms and alliances laid the groundwork for the rise of powerful monarchies. In Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the gradual consolidation of power under Christian kings marked the end of the decentralized Viking chieftaincies. This process was not without conflict, as Viking kings such as Harald Bluetooth and Olaf Tryggvason sought to unify their territories and convert their people to Christianity. Their success in these areas set the stage for the establishment of more centralized and cohesive kingdoms that would play pivotal roles in the history of Europe. In England, the Viking presence left an indelible mark on the political landscape. The Viking raids and subsequent settlements led to the establishment of the Danelaw, a Viking-controlled territory in northeastern England. This territory was governed by Norse laws and customs, and it remained a powerful Viking stronghold until the 11th century. Even after the Danelaw fell to the Anglo-Saxons, Viking influence continued to shape English society. The legacy of Viking rule can still be seen in English place names, legal systems, and even in the culture and language of the region. Beyond their political influence, the Vikings also contributed to the development of European trade. The Vikings were skilled traders and explorers, establishing trade routes that spanned from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean and beyond. They played a crucial role in connecting Europe to the wider world, facilitating the exchange of goods, technologies, and ideas. Viking trading networks helped bring new commodities, such as silks, spices, and precious metals, into Europe, enriching the economies of the regions they touched. In addition to material goods, the Vikings also brought with them new technologies, such as advanced shipbuilding techniques, which would later be adopted by other cultures. In terms of exploration, the Vikings were pioneers. Their ability to navigate vast distances across the open seas, using advanced ships like the Longship, allowed them to explore new lands and establish settlements in areas previously unknown to Europeans. The Vikings were among the first Europeans to set foot in North America, with Leif Erikson's discovery of Vinland around the year 1000. Although the Viking settlement in North America was short-lived, it marked the beginning of European exploration in the Western Hemisphere, predating Christopher Columbus by almost 500 years. The Vikings' seafaring prowess also led them to establish colonies in Greenland and Iceland, where they adapted to harsh environments and created thriving settlements that would survive for centuries. The Viking legacy can also be seen in the realm of language and culture. Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, left a lasting imprint on the languages of the regions they settled. In the British Isles, many place names are derived from Old Norse, such as those ending in by, Thorpe, and stead, which signify Viking settlements. The Vikings also contributed to the English language, with many modern English words having roots in Old Norse. Words like sky, husband, and berserk all trace their origins to the Viking language, a testament to the lasting influence of Viking culture. Moreover, the Vikings left behind a rich cultural and mythological legacy that continues to captivate people today. Norse mythology, with its pantheon of gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, has influenced countless works of literature, art, and pop culture. The Viking sagas, epic tales of heroism, battles, and divine intervention, continue to be a source of inspiration for writers and filmmakers. The stories of mighty warriors and powerful gods have been reimagined in everything from fantasy novels to Hollywood films, helping to preserve the memory of the Vikings for modern audiences. The Vikings also made significant contributions to the field of law and governance. Their system of justice, which was based on personal honor and communal decision-making, influenced the development of legal systems in the regions they inhabited. The Viking thing, a local assembly where free men would gather to make decisions and resolve disputes, played a crucial role in the development of democratic principles. This system of governance, which emphasized the importance of individual rights and communal decision-making, would later influence the development of modern democratic institutions in Europe. As the Viking Age drew to a close, the Vikings themselves began to integrate into the societies they had once raided. Their transformation from feared warriors to settlers, traders, and rulers helped to shape the medieval world and paved the way for the rise of powerful kingdoms in Europe. The Viking Age may have ended, but the influence of the Vikings can still be felt in the language, culture, and political systems of the modern world. In conclusion, the Vikings were far more than the bloodthirsty raiders they are often portrayed as in popular culture. They were explorers, traders, and settlers whose influence helped shape the course of history in Europe and beyond. The Viking Age may have ended over 1,000 years ago, but the legacy of the Vikings lives on in the language, culture, and political structures of the modern world. From their contributions to law and governance to their role in trade and exploration, the Vikings left an indelible mark on history that continues to shape the world today. Their stories of adventure, honor, and exploration continue to captivate our imagination, ensuring that the Viking legacy will endure for generations to come. The Vikings' influence on the world extends well beyond their era of conquest and exploration, having left a lasting imprint on the cultures, societies, and histories of Europe, North America, and even the broader world. While the Viking Age officially ended in the 11th century, their contributions and legacy continue to shape the present day. Much of this influence can be seen in the cultural and societal changes they helped usher in, particularly through their integration with an impact on the societies they encountered during their expansion. In Scandinavia, the transition from Viking paganism to Christianity is perhaps one of the most significant shifts in Viking society. While initially resistant to Christianity, the kings and leaders of Scandinavia began adopting the new faith in the 10th and 11th centuries, marking a profound transformation. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, for example, sought to convert the Viking people by force and persuasion, shaping the course of Norwegian religious history. This Christianization of Scandinavia brought with it significant changes in Viking social practices, including the abandonment of many of the Old Norse traditions such as human sacrifices and the construction of pagan temples. As the Vikings adopted Christianity, they began to more fully integrate into European medieval society, adopting feudal systems, building Christian churches, and becoming more connected with the Christian kingdoms of Europe. This Christianization, however, did not completely erase the Viking spirit. In fact, many of the Viking traits, such as their sense of honor, individual strength, and commitment to bravery, continued to be revered, albeit now within the context of Christian values. These virtues would later help shape the medieval and early modern European conceptions of heroism, often blending Christian ideals with the traditional warrior ethos that had been integral to Viking society. While their raids and expansions eventually ceased, the Vikings' commitment to strength and honor continued to influence the cultures of Northern Europe long after their formal conquest ended. Beyond their religious transformation, the Vikings were also significant in their contributions to European governance and legal practices. The Viking thing, or assembly, was a precursor to the later forms of democratic governance that would emerge in Europe. These gatherings of free men to discuss and resolve disputes helped foster a sense of community decision-making and justice, which would later be reflected in the development of European parliamentary and legal systems. The Vikings' system of wargild, a payment made to the family of a murdered person to prevent blood feuds, also had a significant influence on early medieval legal structures in Europe. The Norse legal system was based on a combination of customary laws and personal responsibility, which laid the foundation for many of the legal practices that would evolve in the Western world. In the British Isles, the Vikings' legacy is still felt today in many aspects of life, particularly through language and place names. The Norse influence on the English language is profound, with many words, especially in northern and eastern England, stemming from Old Norse. Words such as sky, egg, window, and knife all have Viking roots. Similarly, many place names in England and Scotland have Norse origins, particularly in areas once under Viking control, such as York, from the Old Norse, Jorvik, and Grimsby, from Grimsby, meaning Grim's town. These remnants of Viking influence provide a window into the deep impact Vikings had on the British Isles, shaping the language, culture, and identity of the region. The Viking Age also contributed to the growing complexity of European trade networks. As the Vikings expanded their reach, they established trade routes that connected the East and West, spanning vast distances from Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire, the Middle East, and even Asia. The Vikings' extensive trading operations allowed them to acquire a wide range of goods, from luxury silks and spices to precious metals and slaves. In return, they exported furs, timber, and weapons, becoming key players in the global economy of the medieval world. Viking-controlled cities such as Dublin, York, and Novgorod became bustling centers of commerce, linking Europe to the larger world and facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of Viking legacy is their early exploration of the Americas. Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, is believed to have landed in North America around the year 1000, establishing a settlement in what is now Newfoundland, Canada. Although the settlement was short-lived and abandoned after a few years, it remains the first known European expedition to the Americas, predating Christopher Columbus by almost 500 years. This early exploration underscores the Viking spirit of adventure and curiosity, qualities that drove their raids, trade, and expansion across vast distances. The Vikings were not merely warriors, they were also pioneers, explorers, and builders, whose reach extended across the oceans long before the age of European colonialism. The Vikings' impact is also reflected in the art, literature, and culture they left behind. The Viking sagas, written centuries after the events they describe, have become a major part of the literary tradition of Northern Europe. These sagas, epic tales of gods, heroes, and kings, provide valuable insights into Viking society, beliefs, and history. The sagas not only chronicle the heroic deeds of legendary figures like Ragnar Lodbrok and Olaf Tryggvason but also offer glimpses into the everyday lives of Vikings, their relationships, and their worldview. These stories, passed down orally for generations, continue to be a central part of Scandinavian cultural heritage and have inspired countless modern interpretations in literature, film, and television. In modern popular culture, the Vikings are often portrayed as fierce, barbaric raiders. However, this portrayal does not capture the full complexity of their culture and contributions. Today, the Vikings are celebrated not only for their fearsome reputation as warriors but also for their achievements as explorers, traders, and settlers. Their legacy continues to inspire fascination and curiosity, with Viking history and mythology serving as the basis for numerous books, films, television shows, and even video games. The Vikings' story is one of adventure, resilience, and transformation, and their influence can still be seen in the world we live in today. In conclusion, while the Viking Age may have come to an end centuries ago, the legacy of the Vikings endures in countless ways. Their contributions to language, governance, exploration, trade, and culture have left a permanent mark on the history of Europe and beyond. From their early voyages to the Americas to their establishment of powerful kingdoms and influence on European legal systems, the Vikings helped shape the course of history in profound ways. Today, their story continues to captivate and inspire, reminding us of the enduring impact of this remarkable people.